Hello and welcome back to the next in this series of films about runes and runic magic, historical runes and runic magic. So today I'm going to crack on with looking at the written sources, in particular the sagas, and then I'm going to look at how runes and runic magic actually evolved and developed from that point right up until the modern day. So let's consider the Icelandic sagas. There's quite a lot of interesting stuff about runes in the sagas, but we have to be careful when we look at sagas as historical evidence. What we have to bear in mind is that the sagas are written in the 13th century about events that are happening in the Viking Age 3 centuries earlier. They're written by Icelandic Christians. They're like gentlemen farmers, and they really value their old traditional culture. So they remember these things and they tell stories about their ancestors. But these guys are telling stories about things that happened 300 years earlier. So are they actually telling us about what was happening in the Viking Age, or are they telling us more about how they felt things should have been in the Viking Age? Let me try and give you an example to illustrate what I mean. So imagine if someone nowadays from the 21st century, without any specialist knowledge, historical knowledge, wrote down some stories about the 18th century. How accurate would those stories be? You can be sure that they would be coloured by their 21st century viewpoint. And it's the same kind of thing with the sagas. We've got to watch out. Having said that, there is some pretty interesting stuff in there. Okay, so I'm going to pick out some of my favourite bits from the saga of Eggiels Gallegrimson. Now, this is written down in the 13th century, telling the stories about Eggiel, a man from the 10th century. Now, Eggiel is a grumpy and surly man. He's a great warrior, and he's also really famous as a poet. And not only that, but he also works with runes and does spells with runes. So I'm going to pull out a few examples from the saga. So in chapter 44, Eggiel and his companions end up at a farmer's house, a guy called Bard. And Bard is having a massive banquet with a visiting king and his queen. The queen is called Gunhild. Gunhild hates Eggiel. So Bard and the queen have this plot to get Eggiel and his friends puking drunk. And this plot's going pretty well because all Eggiel's friends are on the floor throwing up. But Eggiel's still on his feet and he's calling for more beer. Well, Bard's pretty confounded by this, so he and the queen poison a horn of ale, give it to a maidservant and send her over with the horn to give to Eggiel. Now, Eggiel's suspicious, right? I'm going to quote a translation of the saga. Then Eggiel drew his knife and he stabbed it into the palm of his hand. He took up the horn, carved runes in it and rubbed in the blood. In the saga, we have one of his verses, which I have to paraphrase now, one of the skaldic verses. I carve runes in the horn, redden the spells with blood. I put these spells on the horn. Let us drink the draught poured by cheerful maidservants if we want to. Let us know how the beer that Bard chose us affects us. The horn sprang apart and the drink poured down into the straw. Well, needless to say, by the end of that evening, Bard ends up with a sword stuck through him. Later on, in another chapter, 57, Eggiel is getting really fed up with his enemy, King Eric Bloodaxe, and decides to do something about it. So, the saga tells us how he takes a boat out to an island. He took in his hand a hazel pole, and he climbed onto a rock that jutted out in the direction of the land. Then he took a horse's head and he thrust it on the pole. Then he uttered this curse, saying, "Here I erect a neath pole." Neath is like a word for dishonour or insult. "And I turn this neath towards King Eric and Queen Gunhild." He turned the horse's head towards the land. "I turn this neath against the spirits who guard this land, so that they may wander astray until they drive King Eric and Queen Gunhild from this land." Then he thrust the pole into a cleft in the rock and let it stand there. He turned the head towards the land, he carved the runes in the pole, and he spoke the full curse. There's a similar incident to this described in another saga, Vatnsdæla Saga, also with a Neath pole carved with runes and a curse. Later on in Eggiels Saga, chapter 72, Egil is staying with a friend, and the man's daughter is really sick and she's not in her right mind. And Egil asks the farmer if runes have been carved, or he asks if anything's been done to help her, and the farmer, Thorfinn, says runes have been carved. So Egil goes to the girl's bed and he goes through it until he finds this piece of bone with runes carved on it. And the saga describes how he carves the runes off into the fire and then burns the piece of bone. He has the bedding all taken outside and aired in the wind, and then he carves a new rune stick and puts it under the girl's pillow. And after that she recovers. And then we're told later in the saga that a local boy's fallen in love with the girl, and he had carved these original runes and put them in the bed, but he didn't have the knowledge to do it correctly, and this is what caused her illness. Just a quick mention of another famous saga, the saga of Gretia the Strong. This describes how a witch curses Gretia. She uses the roots of a tree stump. Does that sound familiar? She carves runes into them, stains them with her blood, says spells over them, and then has the tree shoved back into the sea, and she says that that would bring disaster to Gretia, which it surely does, but if you want to know how, you'll have to read the saga. Okay, I'm going to move on from the sagas to just another couple of written references. This is an Anglo Saxon one. This is from Bede's Ecclesiastical History. Bede's Ecclesiastical History is written down in Anglo Saxon England in the 7th century in Latin, but the text I'm referring to is a 10th century retelling of it in Anglo Saxon by a guy called Alfric. Now Alfric relates how there's a captive who's been put in prison and has had chains put on him, but the chains keep falling off him and his captors can't figure out why. And in the end they ask the guy if he's using sorcery, which is called driekraft, or runic letters to free himself, runestaffen. So this tells us that the Anglo-Saxons in the 10th century accept that runic spells, carved runes, can be used to free people from bonds. And then something quite different, there's a Faroese ballad called King Alvor. And now the Pharaoh Islands speak a language similar to Old Norse, and they continue a lot of these old tales and traditions in their ballads. And in this ballad, it describes how a spell is carved into a rune stick, and the rune stick is thrown into the waves, and this has the effect of calming the sea. So again, another written source showing how carved runes are used for magic. Okay, oh yeah. So now I'm going to get on to rune spells and black magic. So this is like, as I said in an earlier film, the use of runes dies out by 1500 at the latest. But there are some spell books that survive from later Scandinavia, 17th century onwards, old spell books and grimoires that talk about runes and rune magic. But in these books, rune magic means something quite different. So the oldest of these books is called Galdrabok. It's written by at least 3 Icelanders and 1 Danish copyist during the 17th century, 16th and 17th century. But the spells in this book are heavily influenced by Southern European traditions. So by that I mean they're using sigils, magical signs, sympathetic magic, and they're invoking supernatural powers to give the wizards or the witches the power they need to work their spells. So Galdrabok mentions Odin and Thor, but they're alongside Satan and Beelzebub and other demons, and they've just become part of the demonic powers that the magician uses for his black magic. Interestingly enough, in the 17th century, so about the same time, 17th century, that Galdrabok is written, we have records of 25 witchcraft trials in Iceland, where men are executed for witchcraft, practicing witchcraft and rune magic. But if Galdrabok is anything to go by, what they mean by rune magic at this point doesn't bear any relation to the Futhark and the runic spells that we know from earlier. But anyway, to continue with a bit more stuff about Galdrabok. Galdrabok has a lot of drawings of mystical sigils, which it calls Galderastafia, which means incantation staves. A couple of these do look a bit like runes, but most of them, they don't look anything like runes. They're sort of weird squiggles and patterns that they would have looked magical to a 17th century Icelander, but they no longer bear any relation to what was understood as runes in an earlier period. Interestingly, the Galdrabok mentions these Galdrastafia and gives them names that seem to be old traditional names, but it's like they've forgotten the original meaning. So the book has swastikas in it, which is an old sun symbol, but Galdrabok calls this Thor's hammer, and I've never come across in any other source how a swastika is connected to either Thor or to Mjolnir. Oh yeah, and there's another symbol which is quite well known nowadays called the Eggiels, which means the helm of terror. This is the name of a stave in Galdrabok. Originally, it was the name in the Elder Edda of a helmet won by the hero Sigurd from the Dragon's Hoard. But by the time it comes down to Galdrabok, it's forgotten that it's a helmet at all, and it's just given as the name of this runic sigil. But in another one of these grimoires, the same sigil is actually called a symbol of Solomon, so something totally different. So it's like they're kind of garbling their old, the memory of old traditions, but these traditions have been mostly forgotten. All right, now I'm going to move on and look at how we managed to get runes once again in use in the modern day. It's all part of this Germanic revival that I spoke about in an earlier film. So we're moving into the time of the antiquarians and their quest to rediscover the culture of the Old North. So this is basically a reinvention of the runes through this Romantic period. It's pretty interesting really, because a lot of this reinvention is stuff that we accept nowadays as being traditional knowledge. In previous films I've been looking at the history of runes after their invention, but now I'm looking at the history of runes after their reinvention. So it's like Galdrabok is a kind of vanishing point for Germanic culture. By the time they get to the 17th century, they've forgotten their Germanic past, and they've mixed it in with Southern European magical practice. So this southern magic is influenced by Christian mysticism, it's got some Jewish Kabbalah in it, as well as a survival of classical magical sources. But at about the same time that Galdrabok is written, Germanic culture is about to undergo rebirth and reinvention. So this starts in the 17th century with this Swedish guy called Johannes Boreas. He has a real interest in discovering this old northern culture, and he rediscovers the runes, by which I mean he tries to read runic runestones again. So these Swedish runestones still exist, but no one can read them anymore. They can't read the runes, the language is forgotten. Well, Boreas finds runic lists in manuscripts, and he starts to reread these runestones. At the same time, he invents, let me just find my place in my notes, yeah. He invents his own magical system based on the Futhark and the Kabbalah, which he calls Adalruna. Now, Boreas is an antiquarian, but he's also a mystic, and he's influenced by Hermeticism and Rosicrucianism, and he brings runes back into, at that time, modern practice again. Now, this revival of the runes catches on, and it combines with this northern culture with a new feeling of nationalism. So we're jumping forward now to the 18th and the 19th centuries, when the different Germanic countries, enthused by this rediscovery of their old past, they start to connects this with a new sense of nationalism. In Germany and German-speaking countries, this is called the folkish movement, the people's movement. And this is like just a mixed subculture with a special passion for anything that's considered to be traditionally Germanic. Now, main proponent of this folkish movement is this guy called Guido List. He's Austrian. He's coming in the mid-19th century. He actually dies in 1919. He's got a big white beard and he sets himself up as a kind of Germanic guru. He changes his name from List to von List because that makes him sound more important. And he reinvents mystical runes and a runic futhark. Now, this runic futhark is based on the younger futhark. It has, instead of 16 runes, it has 18 runes. And he says he bases this on some visions that he's had. This futhark, this new futhark, invented by List, is called the Armanen futhark. Now, this inspires many other runic revivalists around at the time, occultists, people interested in esoteric runic revival, including Karl Maria Willigut, who's in the SS, and he's the one who incorporates runic mysticism into the Nazi ideology. I mean, there are other people getting into runic mysticism at the time, and they actually fall foul of the Nazi authorities, and a couple of them end up being put in concentration camps because they don't believe in the correct kind of runic magic. Well, one of these guys survives. He's called Friedrich Marbu, and he invents a kind of runic gymnastics based on the forms of the runes. And this still survives today as runic yoga. So the Armanen runes, Guido List's runes, are still around, and they're picked up by a guy called Karl Spiesberger. He's a mystic, occultist, Germanic revivalist. He actually survives up until 1992, and he continues to use these runes, but he develops them further, and he removes all the racist theories that were so important to Guido List and others. And since then, this occult power of the runes is it's like an intrinsic part of the revival of Germanic paganism that's still going on today. And most, some forms of this revival of Germanic paganism has totally rejected the earlier ideas of white supremacy and nationalism. Then we move on to the 1980s, where there's a sudden growth in a new area of runic revivalism, and this is the connection of runes to divination, casting the runes, with that book that I mentioned in an earlier film by Ralph Blum, The Book of Runes. And I'm going to start looking at runic divination in the next film. See you then.